Hi, I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea. I want to welcome our listeners to this episode of The American Idea. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the greatest and most important battles in the history of the United States, the Battle of Gettysburg, fought on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863 in the middle of our Civil War. We'll be joined for that conversation today by an old friend, a personal friend, and a great old friend of Ashbrook, Professor Chris Burkett. Many of you know Chris from his work in our Ashbrook student programs, helping to guide the Ashbrook Scholar Program, work with Ashbrook's teacher programs in our Master of Arts in American History and Government, in our Teaching American History seminars, and of course, he has been a frequent guest and always a great guest here on our podcast, The American Idea. Chris received his bachelor's degree here at Ashland University. He was, I think, a double major in art and history. I always like to point that out because he has a great talent for art. And I think it may influence even his the subtlety of his thinking in history. And he also has his master's and PhD from the University of Dallas. Chris has been a member of the faculty here at Ashland University in the Department of History and Political Science for many years. He has published a number of interesting things, and I always like to highlight his editing of our wonderful 50 Core American Documents book. It is a terrific volume. Let me encourage very strongly all of our listeners, if you don't have a copy, go get a copy. You can find it on our website. I'm sure you can find it on online booksellers, or you can just send us a note and request it. Again, that's 50 Core American Documents, edited by Professor Christopher Burkett. It is essential reading for students, teachers, and citizens. If you have a teacher in your life, children, grandchildren, or just yourself and friends, get a copy of it. It's the Great American Documents from, I think it starts with the Declaration of Independence and goes all the way through Ronald Reagan's speech in 1964, A Time for Choosing. Terrific volume, required reading if we're going to revive these principles of America in our hearts and minds. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on The American Idea.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, and especially grateful to be part of this great this project that you're doing here for Americans and the American idea. So thank you.
Gettysburg.
Gettysburg.
If there's one battle of the Civil War that probably everybody's heard of, it's Gettysburg. I think if those who have been to Gettysburg National Park and to the battlefield, it's moving, it's very powerful, it's sweeping in its scope and size. I think a lot of people have heard of Gettysburg. Hopefully some have experienced it personally, but probably not all of our listeners know a lot about the battle itself, the situation before the battle, during the battle, and then after the battle. And if you could take us back to 1863, or maybe even a little bit before, what's happening in the American Civil War that makes the Battle of Gettysburg such an important event?
Yeah, boy, I just, as a matter of fact, I know you know this, I just got back from a 2-day trip to Gettysburg with some Ashbrook scholars, our undergraduate students here. I was fortunate to be part of this trip that Ashbrook does every year for freshmen college students. And we spent 2 days at the battlefield. And so it's fresh in my mind, and every time I go, I sort of have these moments of weeping when I think about the events that took place at this battlefield over the span of 3 days in July. It's a beautiful place. If you haven't been there, anybody who's listening, I can't recommend strongly enough that you go here. It is preserved so well. You can visualize once you sort of know what was going on in the 3 days of the battle. You can actually visualize it so well because of the way the battlefield has been preserved. But it's such an important battle, Jeff, as you say, for primarily, I think, for morale reasons. The Union forces had been struggling with some, let's just say, leadership issues. President Lincoln went through a series of generals that didn't produce the results he was looking for. It's always interesting to me how the Confederate generals, because they knew that they were sort of outnumbered, and given their strategic goals, they were willing to take many more risks, and they relied on battlefield decisions, strategic and tactical changes to win their victories. The Union generals tended to play it much more safe, and as a result, they lost quite a few battles. So in 1863, things aren't looking that great for the Union forces in sort of the Eastern Theater in Virginia. The Union forces earlier that year, or just before Gettysburg, in fact, are coming off of a major defeat at Chancellorsville. And this, in fact, is really demoralizing recruiting efforts for the Union Army, but it's emboldened General Lee to take his army into the North. In fact, they crossed through Maryland into Pennsylvania in June of 1863, thinking that this is sort of going to be the last blow. All they need to do is, their goal is to sort of surround Harrisburg in Pennsylvania, and then sort of offered terms of negotiation to end the war with Lincoln. And the idea here is Lee believes that if they can accomplish that, it will so demoralize people in the North that they'll be willing to come to the table, and this will end the war. So things are at a kind of low, a real low for Lincoln and the Union forces just before the Battle of Gettysburg.
So what's been happening, as you say, the Union morale is low, at least in the East. In the West, we did a podcast episode with Professor Andrew Lang of Mississippi State University on the Battle of Vicksburg, which happened at almost exactly the same time as the Battle of Gettysburg. Of course, Vicksburg, a town on the Mississippi River, and pivotal in a military and strategic way to the Confederate efforts. Andy made the interesting argument to me that Vicksburg and Gettysburg are often remembered together as two of the most important battles. But in fact, Vicksburg was really the important battle.
Yeah.
Because the Union victory there cut the Confederacy in two, west of the Mississippi and east of the Mississippi, and gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River. He said the significance of Gettysburg has been vastly overestimated. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I agree entirely. I know Andy. He's very good on this. And I think he's got a great point here in terms of winning the war or bringing about the end of the war more quickly. Vicksburg is certainly strategically a much more important battle for the reasons that you mentioned. Gettysburg is important, though, more for a morale boost. And again, I don't want to have to skip to the end here in a way, but we'll circle back. Gettysburg, if you think about what Gettysburg accomplishes, it turns back a Confederate invasion of the North. Now, it's true that from that point forward, Lee's forces in the East in Virginia are sort of on the run, and it's a matter of time. It's going to take another couple of almost 2 years for the war to end in Virginia, but it does sort of move the war in that direction. But the immediate effect of the Battle of Gettysburg is the Union forces win. They turn back Lee's invasion of the North. But Lincoln, by the way, is not very happy with the follow-up efforts of the Union forces after the Battle of Gettysburg, because he thought that if General Meade, George Meade, had acted quickly enough, he could actually have cut Lee off and prevented him from retreating, and thus brought about the end of the war much more quickly. So in a certain sense, it's a Union victory at Gettysburg in that it repels a Confederate invasion of the North, but it's also a kind of failure in that it didn't, at least from Lincoln's perspective, that it didn't really do that much to bring about the more immediate end of the war. Vicksburg is a much more strategically important battle for those reasons.
You mentioned Lincoln and his views as commander-in-chief. How had Lincoln, before we get to the particulars of the battle, which of course are important, tell us a little bit, and our listeners, they think of Abraham Lincoln as a great president, as a great orator, a great giver of speeches. They think of him as a profoundly thoughtful person and a great student of the American founding. How had Lincoln's how had he been conducting himself as commander-in-chief? And I'm thinking in particular here, not just of military and strategic decisions, but of his understanding of the conduct of the war up until we get to the point of July 1863.
Oh, that's a great question. And again, I think this question actually is really good because it'll also help us understand the other significance of the Battle of Gettysburg. Again, it's a morale boost insofar as it's a Union victory, but Gettysburg is important because I think it allows Lincoln to continue to work toward, I think, his two goals as commander-in-chief, as president and commander-in-chief of the war. So I'm going to backtrack just a little bit to set this up, if you don't mind. I'm going to go all the way back to 1861 before Lincoln is inaugurated as president. And he gives a speech in Philadelphia in front of the State House, what we now call Independence Hall, in which he says, "I never had a feeling politically that didn't arise from the sentiments expressed in the Declaration of Independence." And I think his war strategy actually plays this out. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you think of Lincoln's conduct as commander-in-chief during the war, or the rebellion, as he called it, you have to think of Lincoln as wearing sort of two hats. There's Lincoln, the man, the citizen, the human being who deeply believes that slavery is wrong and would love nothing more than to see slavery end before the end of the war. But then there's Lincoln, the president, who has taken an oath to follow the Constitution, and his primary job is as commander-in-chief to put down the rebellion or end the war, right? So Lincoln has these two goals that he would like to see accomplished. He's got to do everything he can to end the war and put down the rebellion. He has an obligation, a constitutional obligation to do that. So he's doing things, working with generals and helping them formulate overall strategies that will help end that war, right? That will end the rebellion and bring about the end of the war. And to do that, he knows he's got to cut off supplies to the South. He's got to cut off the ability of the South to the Confederate States to conduct trade with foreign nations, especially Great Britain. So Lincoln immediately implements a naval blockade of southern ports. And then, of course, eventually you get Grant, winning victories like at Vicksburg and others in the Western Theater. So Lincoln is doing those things necessary as commander-in-chief to eventually bring the war to an end. But I think what's often overlooked is how he is also conducting the war so that hopefully sort of coterminous with the end of the war, we'll also see the end of slavery. So Lincoln knows that he has to keep the border states, right, so-called border states, Delaware, Maryland, the western part of Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. He's got to keep them on the Union side. To lose Kentucky is to lose the war, right? The problem is they have slavery. So what do? You've got to keep them, fighting for the Union. But Lincoln would like to see slavery end, especially in those border states. So he initially, launches a program of compensated emancipation, tries to get Congress to go along with this so that slave owners in those border states would be paid to free their slaves. That doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't work. But I think it kind of reveals how Lincoln is trying to both win the war and end slavery. So insofar as he's sort of constitutionally allowed to do this sort of simultaneously. So if I can just throw out one more point. So just another example, Lincoln is often criticized as commander-in-chief for authorizing his generals to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, right? And he does this, and several of his generals will do that, and they will also confiscate and emancipate slaves under their authority, right, to do this. And quite often Lincoln will retract or overturn their decisions to emancipate slaves, these generals who had conquered parts of the South, right? And he's often criticized for this. And some scholars have said, well, this shows that Lincoln didn't really care about ending slavery. I think it shows the opposite. I think that it shows Lincoln knew that there are limits, there's sort of prudent limits to what you can do with regard to emancipating slaves and ending them. You want to accomplish that, but you have to do it in a way that won't at the same time cost, victory in the war or lead to losing the war, right? Because again, you got to keep the border states. You got to keep those slave states, Kentucky and others, right, with the Union. So this has to be done very, very carefully. I'm sorry, Jeff, you look like you wanted to jump
No,
in.
it sounds like a very delicate balance, a very delicate balance. And I'm thinking in particular, you mentioned George Meade, who is the commander of Union forces at Gettysburg. You mentioned U.S. Grant, who at this time is in the Western Theater, places like at Vicksburg.
Right.
Tell us a little bit more about Lincoln's generals. I'm thinking again in generals in the East, because if Lincoln is trying to accomplish these twin aims of holding the Union together by defeating the rebellion, but in that moment simultaneously trying to get rid of slavery as much as he constitutionally can, which ultimately, of course, is the 13th Amendment, right? As he called it, the King's Cure. But he's still trying to work that. Does he have generals who understand that? And do they conduct the war in accordance with those aims? Or does he have generals who are all in favor of putting down the rebellion, but don't care about slavery, or all about abolitionism and don't really care about winning the war? Where is he with a general like George Meade or other generals that he's got to rely on in the East?
Yeah, that's another great question. So there are some of his generals, so General Butler and others who famously, when they're given the green light to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in parts of the South that they've sort of reclaimed, they will go ahead and they will issue emancipation proclamations, sort of mini emancipation proclamations liberating slaves. And they will do, some of these generals would do so on the grounds that that's the right and just thing to do, but also that it's necessary to win the war. And again, Lincoln will sometimes tell those generals, no, you don't have the constitutional authority to do that, because at that point, some of these issues or these decisions by his generals were done in 1862, prior to the big Emancipation Proclamation that we know comes in fall of 1862 and then January 1st of 1863. But a lot of his generals were freeing slaves, and Lincoln would overturn those decisions on the grounds, publicly on the grounds that it really was not a military necessity at that time to do that. Thinking again that the only justifiable grounds for emancipating slaves at this point by generals was it's necessary for purposes of winning the war. And Lincoln argued at this point that was not necessary. Now, this might be a little controversial. I think that's one reason Lincoln gave, but I think it's in the back of his mind, he's always thinking of the effect that these sorts of decisions by his generals will have on the states like Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware and Missouri, right? If they see these Union generals going around liberating slaves, they start thinking to themselves, wow, this is no longer a war to save the Union. This is a war for emancipation. We're out. There's always that threat, Lincoln thought, that he would lose those border states if they believed the war was turning into a war to end slavery. So Lincoln had to be very careful about this business of allowing his generals to emancipate slaves.
Before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to take a moment and ask you to learn a little more about the Ashbrook Center and how you can help us continue our work with teachers, students, and citizens.
I'm Chad Kiefer, Director of Philanthropy and Strategic Partnerships here at Ashbrook. At its heart, America's story is about the lives of patriots who have given their last full measure of devotion to preserve and protect what it means to be an American. But the tragic truth is that the American story is being rewritten as one of oppression and despair. Back in 1776, the founders took a chance when they created a new government built on principles of liberty. They took a chance on America. Now I'm challenging you to do the same. Your gift to Ashbrook today reaches students, teachers, and citizens across the country, helping them to understand why America is worthy of their devotion. With so many forces eroding our history and taking away from our principles, isn't it time we give America a chance? Your investment is encouraged now more than ever. Please visit us today at ashbrook.org/support.
So Lincoln's conduct until 1863, as you say, is guided by these twin principles. The Union is having great success in the West, or at least culminating in the Battle of Vicksburg. In the East, right, there's been frustration. Lee crosses the Mason-Dixon line, invades Pennsylvania, hopes, as you said, strategically hopes that this will, not that he's going to take over and occupy the North, but that it defeats Union morale such that the people of the Union are willing to sue for peace, right? That's his sort of limited but very significant political aim. The battle itself, from my understanding of it, it starts as almost an accidental battle in the late June or July 1st of 1863.
Right. Yeah, it was. They weren't. Both sides weren't quite sure where that battle was going to take place. In the sort of fog of war, it's hard to know where the other side is, where their forces are. General George Meade, by the way, had only been appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac 2 days before the battle. There was some decision that was made. It was actually it was hoped that General John Reynolds of the Union forces would take that post, and he declined, not so respectfully, because he didn't like dealing with the bureaucrats in Washington. So the command went to George Meade, and he's far behind coming up from the south, trying to catch up to Lee's forces, but they're not quite sure where each side is at. So Lee, again, is trying to work his way over to Harrisburg. By the way, Jeff, on your point about the strategy that Lee is undertaking here, Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, already had written out his demands that were to be telegraphed to Lincoln as soon as he got word that Lee had reached Harrisburg. That's how confident he was that this strategy was going to work.
Wow. Okay.
But so Meade is trying to catch up. Now, there's an advanced detachment of cavalry under the command of John Buford, Union cavalry, that arrives in Gettysburg, and he is through his sort of scouts that are out there, he discovers that he has almost come up against the rear guard of the Confederate forces moving toward Harrisburg. And so there's a kind of accidental sort of bumping into each other. This is late June, as you said, June 29th, June 30th. Some Confederate forces, turn around and start shooting. They're not sure if they should go on or come back. John Buford's not sure if the Confederates are going to keep marching or come back, but just to be safe, he sets up defensive positions just northwest of the town of Gettysburg. And fortunately he did, because it very quickly becomes clear on the night before July 1st that this is where the battle is going to take place. So I think it's General Hill's forces of the Confederate troops are turning around and marching en masse back to Gettysburg. So John Buford is there first. He is the reason the battle takes place there, and he very quickly sort of sets up, defensive lines that become the first line of skirmishes on the morning of July 1st.
So take us back to July 1st. What happens on that first day of the battle?
Yeah, most of the fighting that day at Gettysburg is northwest of the city. And again, I was just there, and you can see through the monuments and some of the fortifications, very quick and rudimentary sort of fencing and things that are thrown up where the battles take place. It's a hard fought battle that first day, and it's essentially because all you have are the Union cavalry here under General Buford really doing the brunt of the fighting. General John Reynolds, the Union general, does show up that day, and he is to take command of the forces. He is way in advance of General Meade. Meade is still catching up with the main body of troops. General Reynolds shows up and takes command, and there's heavy fighting northwest of the city. And General Reynolds is killed the first day of battle. So the first day of battle is actually, I think, looking good for the Confederate forces. They seem to be pushing the Union forces back, and so with Reynolds' death at the end of day one, General Buford decides that it's best to sort of fall back and take up defensive positions south of Gettysburg. So it looks like the Confederates have pushed the Union forces back. In fact, it's a very thoughtful, tactical fallback on the part of the Union forces to the high ground just south of the town, starting with Cemetery Hill, which is where Gettysburg National Cemetery is, by the way, today, and then Culp's Hill. So just sort of south and east of Gettysburg are these two important hills, and the Union forces fall back and occupy the high ground, which is the absolute right move for them to make.
So it's interesting, right? Because our listeners, if they can picture this on a map, as you said, the Confederate forces are north of the Union forces, heading north toward Harrisburg, and the Union forces are trying to catch up with them from the south. and
Right.
that they do catch up with them. And then, as you say, the Confederate forces start to turn and head back south to Gettysburg while the main Union forces are coming north. That first day, the Confederates push and the Union forces fall back strategically. What about the next day, July 2nd?
Yeah, July 2nd. So July 2nd is the day when the real hero of Gettysburg, if I can say this, Winfield Scott Hancock, takes over. And he sets up, now that the Union forces have the high ground in Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, he forms this famous Union line that's known as the fish hook. Again, it's kind of hard to visualize without a map. So I don't know if I'm doing it the right way on the screen or not, but Union forces in the north wrap around these two hills, Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill to the east. And then the rest of the Union forces line up along what's called Cemetery Ridge. And the sort of the southern tip of that ridge ends up around Little Round Top. So day 2 is where some important events or some important moments take place in the battle because of so by the way, the Union forces have done exactly the right thing. They formed their lines properly. They've got the high ground. But there's one general in particular, I don't want to overdo this, but there's General Dan Sickles of the Union forces, who is a sort of, well-known politician who's now in charge of some troops as a general here at Gettysburg Union troops. And he has the left flank, sort of the southern flank of the Union forces. And the Confederate forces are lined up across the field about 3/4 of a mile away on what's called Seminary Ridge. But Dan Sickles, General Sickles, has the southern flank protected. He doesn't like where he's at. He can't see what's going on, so he decides to move his entire force forward a few hundred yards so he can get a better view of what the Confederates are doing. The problem is he leaves the Union southern flank entirely exposed. General Longstreet of the Confederate forces takes advantage of that and tries to outflank him to the south. And by the way, Sickles' troop, his men are just mowed down. I mean, they pay the price for that bad move that he made. And some people may have heard of the Peach Orchard. Confederate forces occupy what's called the Devil's Den, which gives them sort of, a great vantage point for shooting at Union forces at the end of their line. But Sickles' troops pay the price. The problem is now Longstreet is trying to outflank Union forces on the south. And Winfield Scott Hancock, again, is just this great commander at the battle. He has the presence of mind to know when and where to shift troops where they're needed. So he has to shift troops around to the east because there's a major battle taking place at Culp's Hill. But he also realizes that the southern flank is exposed. So it falls on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and others. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, professor of rhetoric at Bowdoin College, who wanted to get into the fight. His college wouldn't let him go, so he applied for a sabbatical. And instead of going to Europe to do research, he joined the army. So he's there leading the 20th Maine.
Yeah, a truly useful professor, right?
But yeah, finally, a useful professor. Anyway, so I shouldn't say that. But so it falls on him and a group of about 50 of his men or so, and his brothers there. They have to shift down to Little Round Top and stop a Confederate outflanking maneuver made up mostly of Alabama men and Texan men. And they fight them off in a really brief but bloody fight that ends up, by the way, in a bayonet charge. A lot of people are killed here, but Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine hold the Union flank. And if they hadn't done that, it's very possible that flank could have crumpled, and that could have ended the battle with the Confederate victory. So very significant moment there at the Battle of Little Round Top, which you can still visit and see today. Very well preserved. They're doing some work on it right now, but it's really worth the trip to see it. So day 2 ends with some really brave, heroic actions on the part of both sides, but the Union lines hold.
All right, then day 3, July 3rd.
July 3rd. So the fateful day, right? The last day of the battle. And General Lee believes that because General Winfield Scott Hancock has had to shift his forces around so much that his middle the middle of the Union line has been weakened, right? So he believes the Union forces have been stretched thin. And so he orders the famous charge that is known today primarily as Pickett's charge, although there were other generals involved in this. But the bulk of the men who would be on that charge and who would die on that charge were from General Pickett's brigade. By the way, General George Pickett, fascinating side note, very brave soldier. A lot of people may not know this, but he and Abraham Lincoln were personal friends. And in fact, Lincoln was responsible for his getting into the army, into West Point, I believe. And he was a Confederate general, but he did not allow anybody to say anything bad about Lincoln in his presence, which I find interesting.
Wow.
Anyway, so it falls to this guy, General George Pickett, to offer up his brigade of men to this charge. Ultimately, really under the command of General James Longstreet, but Pickett's brigade, his men made up the bulk of those who made the charge. Again, it's a long walk across this open field. They give the order, they start advancing, and the Union artillery is just devastating. If you go there and see, I've walked the route that they've taken several times, and if you can just imagine, out of nowhere, cannonballs raking across the line of men in front of you and behind you, is just withering fire from the Union artillery, and this is going on for 20 minutes as they're marching across this field in heavy uniforms. And they finally, some of them make it across the field, and they make it to what's known as the high water mark of the Confederacy, where a group of Confederate soldiers do actually break through the Union lines under the command of General Scott, and but they are captured or beaten back, and then you have this long retreat back. There's this great story too, though, about one of the generals who was on the charge, Lewis Armistead. He was a close personal friend of Union General Winfield Scott Hancock, and he made it to the other side. He made it to the Union lines, was mortally wounded, and his last words were, "Is General Hancock around? I'd like to see him." And unfortunately, Hancock had also been wounded and couldn't see him, but Hancock survived, but Armistead died, and it was just a devastating end to the battle for the Confederacy. So I think 60% casualties among Pickett's men. I think it was something like 8,000 casualties.
So after the collapse of Pickett's charge, what happens then on either July 3rd or the next day, now that the battle seems to have been decided in the Union favor?
Yeah. That evening, Lee orders a strategic retreat, and they start to march south. And at that point, the losses have been so devastating for them. Everybody knows it at this point. He has got to get back to Virginia to resupply and try to find more men. And so at this point, it's sort of a race for him to get back into Virginia, where he can resupply. And General Meade would later, I mentioned this earlier, but General Meade would later receive a letter from Lincoln, first of all, congratulating him on the victory, but in the same letter, admonishing him for not acting quickly enough to cut Lee off and allowing him to retreat back into Virginia. And Meade, again, I hesitate to say bad things about men who do things that I myself couldn't do. I mean, he was a general, so I don't think I could do that. But it's probably true that Meade acted too cautiously and conservatively, and didn't act quickly enough to cut Lee off. It's very possible that he could have done that and ended the war much more quickly in the East. But
so Gettysburg may not have been the single bloodiest day in the Civil War, but over a period of 3 days, I think it's right to say it's the single bloodiest battle.
yes.
How many troops were involved on both sides? And if you have a sense, what were the numbers of casualties?
Yeah, 50,000 casualties over 3 days, which does make it the bloodiest battle. The bloodiest single day was at Antietam, but the bloodiest battle is Gettysburg, 50,000 casualties, about 23, I think, Union casualties, 23,000 Union casualties and 27,000 Confederate casualties.
Wow.
And the Union had a larger, of course, more troops. So the percentage of casualties was much higher for the Confederate forces, which is why Lee at this point desperately needed to get back to Virginia, and so, which he does. But now, not to shift gears here too much, but you mentioned earlier, of course, Grant is out in the West and he's winning. Lincoln has been dealing with a series of sort of overly cautious generals in the East. It's shortly after Gettysburg that President Lincoln will appoint Grant in charge of all the armies, and Grant will come over and finish the job in the East in Virginia, and really capitalize on this. So
you mentioned all those casualties. Probably the other most famous thing about Gettysburg is the address that President Lincoln gives later when he comes back to Gettysburg on November 19th, 1863. So a number of months after the battle, the Gettysburg Address, which is given to dedicate the National Cemetery there for Union soldiers.
Right.
In Lincoln's mind, what's the significance of the Battle of Gettysburg?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think after Gettysburg, and he reveals this in a very subtle Lincolnian way in his Gettysburg Address, but after Gettysburg, I think Lincoln is able to be much more open about his hope that the war will not just save the Union, but will end slavery. And if you, again, one of the greatest speeches ever written, if not the greatest speech, in my opinion, the Gettysburg Address. In the second paragraph, Lincoln talks about why he is there. And I'll just read from it. He says, we are met on a great battlefield of this war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. And when he says that, what he's saying here is we are dedicating a cemetery, we're burying men who died that that nation might live. And that nation that he's referring to is the nation that he says was brought forth by our fathers in 1776, that was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So the men we're burying here at Gettysburg in the cemetery, Lincoln says, I'm paraphrasing, Lincoln says it much more beautifully than I can, right? But we're burying men here, and the reason these men died was to bring into being, maybe for the first time, that nation, a nation that is truly dedicated to all men being created equal. So again, he doesn't come right out and say, this is the purpose of this war is to end slavery. But I think he makes it clear in this speech and in subsequent speeches after Gettysburg that the goal is, of course, we've got to win the war. But if we can, any way that we can, if we can make this happen, we should strive to finish the work of ending slavery as well, right? So that this will not only be a war to save the Union, but to make it a Union worthy of the saving, as he will say in another speech.
And hence Lincoln, after the Battle of Gettysburg and in 1864, endorses and embraces the 13th Amendment,
of course,
to abolish slavery.
Yeah. And then then it becomes a race, right? Can we end slavery through the 13th Amendment before the war ends? And that also affects Lincoln's war strategy moving forward. But,
Chris, best books in your mind? You've studied the Battle of Gettysburg. You've studied Abraham Lincoln for a number of years. In your mind, for our listeners, what are some of the best books, movies, or TV shows that they could take a look at on Gettysburg, the Civil War, or Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah, great. I'm happy to answer. That's a great question. I think a lot of people would say that one of the best books on Gettysburg is called Killer Angels by Michael Shara, Shaara. It's a fantastic book written from the perspectives of the men who were there, including the Confederate generals and the Union generals, and especially Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. It's a fantastic book. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And the movie Gettysburg is based largely on this book. So it's a good read, very insightful, and it gets the history right for the most part, I believe. So really recommend that book as well. Or the book and the film Gettysburg is, I think, pretty well done. His son wrote a book. It's not necessarily on Gettysburg, but it's sort of on the Civil War and how that leads up to Gettysburg. His son, Jeff Shara, wrote a book called Gods and Generals, which I also recommend. I think it's a good read. And it helps to set up how we end up at Gettysburg. Why are we there? How did these men come to be there in the positions that they're in? So recommend that book as well. It was also made into a movie, which I think was pretty good. So
terrific recommendations. Chris, thanks for taking the time to be with us today to shed light on one of the most important moments in American history, and really in helping us understand the meaning of the Civil War and ultimately, I suppose, America's principles themselves. Thank you for taking the time to join us on The American Idea.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.